Francis Collins is the most celebrated evangelical Christian scientist in America. Unfortunately, Collins' model for integrating his faith with his science is deeply flawed. It depends largely on Christians conceding ground whenever their faith comes into conflict with claims made by the scientific establishment. Francis Collins is the most celebrated evangelical Christian scientist in America. He catapulted to fame and the cover of Time magazine as the head of the Human Genome Project. He then became a hero to many Christians with the publication in 2006 of his book, The Language of God, which recounted his inspiring personal journey from atheism to Christianity. From 2009 to 2021, Collins served as the head of the National Institutes of Health, making him one of the federal government's most important and most powerful science officials. More recently, he served as acting White House science advisor for former President Joe Biden. For many Christians, Collins has become the equivalent of a rock star. Unfortunately, Collins' model for integrating his faith with his science is deeply flawed. It depends largely on Christians conceding ground whenever their faith comes into conflict with claims made by the scientific establishment or dominant culture. I don't question the sincerity of Collins' faith, but despite his wide influence, I don't think he's a good guide for integrating Christianity and science. Consider the issue of abortion. The Bible teaches that life inside the womb is created and planned by God. In the words of Psalm 139, "You created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be." From the earliest of times, Christians have believed that abortion and infanticide were wrong. In more recent decades, evangelical Christians have been strongly opposed to abortion. Thus, most people would probably expect Francis Collins to be pro-life, since he is an evangelical Christian. They would be wrong. First of all, Collins doesn't seem to know when human life actually begins. In an appendix to his book, The Language of God, he casts doubt on the insistence that the spiritual nature of a person is uniquely defined at the very moment of conception. According to one media profile, Collins sees a human embryo as a potential life, though he thinks that it is not possible scientifically to settle precisely when life begins. According to another journalist, Collins is dubious of the idea that life begins at the very moment of conception. Collins has even justified eugenic abortions of infants with Down syndrome, telling BeliefNet that in our current society, people are in a circumstance of being able to take advantage of those technologies like abortions. And we have decided as a society that that choice needs to be defended. Collins' muddled and unbiblical thinking on abortion has had stark, real-world consequences. As NIH director, Collins championed the unrestricted funding of embryonic stem cell research, which involves the destruction of human embryos for medical research. And in 2021, Collins implemented the repeal of Trump administration restrictions on the use of aborted fetal tissue in NIH-funded research. These actions were only the tip of the proverbial iceberg. We now know that the NIH under Collins funded gruesome experiments utilizing body parts collected from aborted human babies to create humanized mouse and rodent models with full-thickness human skin. For these experiments, researchers at the University of Pittsburgh cut into tiny pieces human fetal spleen, thymus, and liver organs, and then transplanted the tissues and stem cells into irradiated mice. Researchers also sliced off skin from the scalp of aborted babies and then grafted the fetal skin onto the mice. The body parts used for these experiments were harvested from aborted human fetuses with a gestational age of 18 to 20 weeks. By that age, an unborn baby has brain waves and a beating heart. He can hear sounds and move his limbs and eyes, and his digestive system has started to work. In other words, the human babies whose organs were harvested for this NIH-funded research were well-developed tiny humans, not blobs of undifferentiated cells. Again, this happened while Francis Collins was in charge of the NIH. Thanks to documents obtained through a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit, we also know now about the NIH's role in facilitating the use of baby parts in research on a nationwide level. According to Judicial Watch, documents show that the NIH under Collins provided nearly $3 million tax dollars to support a fetal organ harvesting operation by the University of Pittsburgh in its quest to become a tissue hub for human fetal tissue ranging from 6 to 42 weeks in gestation. A baby that is over 40 weeks, that's basically infanticide, to harvest their body parts. David Dalladin, president of the Center for Medical Progress, alleged that NIH funding was used to underwrite labor induction abortions, where the baby is pushed out of the mother whole and then killed to obtain the desired tissues. In other words, the NIH was facilitating a process where babies, some at the age of viability, are to be delivered alive and then killing them by cutting their kidneys out. Abortion isn't the only area, however, where Collins has conformed to the reigning culture. As NIH director, he threw his enthusiastic support behind the LGBTQIA political and social movement, pledging in 2021 to be an ally and an advocate of the movement, although he called himself merely a white, cisgender, and heterosexual man. But Collins didn't just offer verbal support. Under Collins' leadership, the NIH funded researchers in hospitals that promoted puberty blockers and sex-destructive surgeries on minors. Your tax dollars at work. Although Collins has repeatedly failed to challenge the secular establishment in areas of abortion and sexuality during his career, there is one group he has been quite willing to challenge publicly: his fellow Christians. During the COVID pandemic, Collins harshly attacked fellow Christians and others who didn't want to take the COVID vaccine, either because of concerns about safety or because of moral qualms about vaccines that use fetal cell lines originally derived from aborted babies in their development, production, or testing. Now, reasonable people can differ about whether the COVID-19 vaccines were good to take for themselves or others. And I certainly don't think it was unchristian for believers like Collins to advocate that people be vaccinated. But that's not all that happened. And we need to be really honest here about what happened. In some cases enlisted by the government, a number of Christian leaders began to stridently condemn their fellow Christians who didn't want to be vaccinated for being selfish, uncaring, or worse. They not only attacked their fellow Christians for what was a sincere and conscientious difference of opinion, they encouraged their dehumanization, even their persecution, all in the name of loving thy neighbor, a biblical injunction which they weaponized against other Christians. Collins was part of this effort. In April of 2021, at an online town hall, Collins promised,
"There's not going to be any mandating of vaccines from the U.S. government, I can assure you."
Let's hear that one more time.
"There's not going to be any mandating of vaccines from the U.S. government, I can assure you."
There's not going to be any mandating of vaccines from the U.S. government, I can assure you. Yet just a few months later, Collins was lavishing praise on the Biden administration's expansive vaccine mandates, including one imposed illegally on private businesses. Appearing on MSNBC in September of 2021, Collins lauded Biden's draconian mandates as
a very forceful, muscular approach.
In the same interview, Collins implied that unvaccinated people were selfish.
This is really an occasion to think about loving your neighbor, not just yourself.
Collins then portrayed unvaccinated people and politicians who didn't favor vaccine mandates as killers on the wrong side of history.
This culture war, in this case, is killing people. It's not just a philosophical, political argument. It's killing people, including, I'm sad to say, some children. We will not escape history. Do you want to be looked at in the lens of that backward look 10 years from now and defend what you did when, in fact, we are losing tens of thousands of lives that didn't have to die?
So if you didn't take the COVID vax, you're a killer of children. Throughout COVID, Collins was openly dismissive of the concerns of fellow Christians who dissented from this view, refused to seriously interact with them, turned a blind eye to their demonization, favored censoring them, and advocated policies that would deprive them of their livelihoods by mass firings. Far from respecting the rights of conscience of his fellow Christians to disagree with him, he instead facilitated their dehumanization. It should be noted here that Collins' promotion of nearly universal COVID mandates was not based on science. For example, the muscular federal mandates he championed allowed for no exemptions for those who had already had COVID and therefore had natural immunities, at least as good as those from the vaccine. Late last year, we learned that Collins was part of a private meeting with virus experts to talk about natural immunity. According to one participant who favored the COVID vaccine, these experts all agreed that natural immunity was at least as good as vaccine immunity. Therefore, there was no scientific reason not to exempt people who had COVID already from these vaccine mandates. The difference of opinion was not about the science, only about the political realities of offering exemptions. I have to say that Collins' mistreatment of fellow Christians who disagreed with him during COVID was not a surprise to many Christians who had dealt with him previously, especially those in the intelligent design movement. Well before COVID, Collins engaged in a years-long quest to marginalize and attack Christian scientists, scholars, and lay people who are skeptical of Darwinian evolution or who think biology shows evidence of intelligent design. In 2006, Collins published his best-selling book titled The Language of God. The title referred to the DNA code. If you didn't read the book, you might assume Collins was arguing that DNA was somehow intelligently designed by God. After all, it's a code, isn't it? And a code requires a coder. Well, that wasn't Collins' view. Collins actually argued in his book that our genome is riddled with useless junk DNA, produced by the haphazard process of Darwinian evolution. Collins acknowledged that it required a certain amount of hubris for anyone to call any part of the genome junk, but that didn't stop him from doing so anyway. At one point in his book, he asserted that nearly half of our human genome is made up of genetic flotsam and jetsam. For Collins, this provided decisive evidence against intelligent design in biology, because in his view, an intelligent creator wouldn't have included so much useless junk. While conceding that some might argue that these are actually functional elements placed there by the creator for a good reason, Collins ends up dismissing that explanation in his book. So in his view, DNA doesn't seem to be the language of God at all, unless God is very inarticulate. The only kind of intelligent design in biology that Collins suggests might be tolerable is the hidden variety. He offers the option of believing in a God who hides his actions in nature. According to this view, God could be completely and intimately involved in the creation of all species, while from our perspective, this would appear a random and undirected process. In other words, so long as you acknowledge that your belief in the design of life is simply personal and not grounded in empirical reality, that might be permissible. You can personally believe life was designed so long as you acknowledge that the evidence from nature makes it look like life was the product of a random and undirected process. As I show in my book, Collins' views contradict 2 millennia of Christian teaching going back to Psalm 19 in the Old Testament and Romans 1 in the New. Collins has criticized Christians who question Darwinian evolution for peddling lies, his term, and promoting anti-scientific thinking, also his term. Collins has even warned that intelligent design, quote, is potentially threatening to America's future, unquote. To evangelize against intelligent design, Collins helped found the BioLogos Foundation, where he convened private meetings to try to convince evangelical leaders to embrace Darwin. Collins said he wanted to promote dialogue, but the dialogue that he was promoting was decidedly one-sided, excluding leading Christian scientists who strongly favored intelligent design in biology. In other words, Collins wanted to win the debate by making sure the other side didn't have a voice or a seat at the table. Collins basically contends that the evidence for Darwinian evolution is beyond serious dispute and claims that intelligent design in biology fails scientifically. As I document in my book, however, science has not been kind to Collins' critique of intelligent design. For example, his previous claim that the genome is littered with junk DNA has been largely discredited by mainstream science, and he has had to abandon it. But in a new book published last fall, Collins continues to attack pro-intelligent design biochemist Michael Behe. Behe became famous for proposing that many molecular machines are irreducibly complex, meaning they require all their parts to perform their function. Behe argues that such systems cannot be produced by an unguided, step-by-step Darwinian process, because the individual parts don't have value for the system until they are all in place. Hence, natural selection would never have selected them one at a time. Behe's iconic example of an irreducibly complex system is the bacterial flagellum, a sophisticated molecular propeller that enables bacteria to move through liquid. In his original book, The Language of God, Collins confidently assured readers that producing the flagellum would pose no problem for Darwinian evolution because there is a less complex type 3 secretory apparatus that the flagellum could have evolved from. Science has undermined his argument, however. Biologists now think the flagellum originated before the type 3 secretory apparatus and thus cannot have been its ancestor. Either the type 3 secretory apparatus devolved from the flagellum or it originated independently from it. Either way, the flagellum existed first, and the secretory apparatus came later. Contra Collins, the secretory apparatus offers absolutely no explanation for how the flagellum came to be through an unguided Darwinian process. Someone must have informed Collins of this problem because the type 3 secretory apparatus is nowhere to be found in his new book. Instead, he offers a new sweeping statement. Quote, progressive scientific advances have shown that nanomachines like the flagellum have actually been assembled from components that had their own previous important functions, making the outcome understandable on the basis of traditional evolutionary mechanisms. Ultimately, ID theory has fallen victim to advances in science that reveal natural explanations for constructs that were claimed to require supernatural explanation. Notice, Collins offers no specifics in this new statement, no examples, no actual evidence, nor does he provide any citations whatsoever to back up his sweeping claims. He simply asserts that progressive scientific advances have shown. Contrary to Collins' science by soundbite, those progressive scientific advances don't appear to exist. As Michael Behe himself told me, Darwinists can't even account for a crummy disulfide bond, let alone a fantastically complex molecular machine like the bacterial flagellum. Francis Collins simply ignores all difficulties and pledges allegiance to the only explanation academia permits. To be sure, evolutionists continue to speculate that irreducibly complex structure must have been cobbled together from simpler parts with different functions through an unguided process. But they definitely haven't shown that they were actually assembled in that way, contra Collins. Indeed, the main concrete example they proposed for this hypothesis with regard to the flagellum, the type 3 secretory system, has been shown not to fit the hypothesis. It's been disconfirmed. But the problem with Collins' position against irreducible complexity actually goes deeper than this, much deeper. Suppose evolutionists could identify an array of simpler systems that preceded in time an irreducibly complex molecular machine like the flagellum and resembled some of its parts. In and of itself, this would not prove their case. Behe points out the flaw. Even if there were resemblances to other machines, it would still beg the question of whether the resemblances were common design and if the assembly process were random or guided. Collins is simply ignoring all such difficulties. So ultimately, it isn't intelligent design that has fallen victim to advances in science. It's Darwin's outdated theory. But Collins continues to cling to his critique of intelligent design in biology in spite of the evidence. So what's going on here? By all indications, Collins is a personally devout Christian, and I don't question that. But many of his policies and positions have been indistinguishable from those of secular materialists. Why? In my book, I suggest that the best way to understand Collins and a number of others is as an example of something I call Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. The Stockholm Syndrome takes its name from a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden in August 1973. One morning, an escaped convict entered the bank with a submachine gun. For the next 131 hours, the convict, later joined by an accomplice, held 4 bank employees hostage. Over the course of the crisis, though, something strange happened. The hostages began to bond with the criminals and view the police and government as their enemies. Even when the criminals threatened violence, the hostages expressed gratitude toward them. At one point, the main bank robber planned to shoot a hostage in the leg to show authorities he was serious. The hostage later recalled, "All that comes back to me is how kind I thought he was for saying it was just my leg he would shoot." Now, actually, if I were in that situation, I probably would be grateful too that the guy wasn't wanting to shoot me in the head. But still, I think you can see here that this is really sort of a strange thing to be grateful to your hostage takers and to be not, to have negative feelings towards the police or others. The term Stockholm Syndrome was later coined to describe situations where hostages end up identifying with their captors. Although it remains highly controversial as an actual psychological diagnosis, the label has since been used to describe victims who end up adopting the point of view of their captors or their abusers. And so I'm using it in the more popular way of understanding, that this is a good way of understanding what can happen to someone who has dealt with a lot of hostility in their life from maybe groups and fellow friends and others who may be hostile, in this case to Christianity, and they end up adopting their views. So how is this relevant to today's Christian community? Well, most Christians in America grow up in cultural captivity. They're immersed in a culture hostile to genuine Christianity at home, school, college, and the workplace. This is especially true of those who go on to become professors, journalists, filmmakers, politicians, and yes, scientists. After they've been immersed for years in an elite culture that rejects Orthodox Christianity, they can easily start identifying more with those who hate Christianity than those who embrace it. They can become Stockholm Syndrome Christians. I've seen this attitude again and again among church leaders, among Christian scientists and academics, among Christians in government, among Christians in the entertainment industry and in the media. At the Christian university where I taught for many years, it was common for my colleagues to express their disdain for ordinary Christians in the pews. Those ordinary Christians didn't know as much as the professors, after all. They were crude. They were gullible. They were unsophisticated. They were annoying embarrassments who put everyone in danger, meaning the educated classes, the professors, put them in danger because those ordinary people attracted the attention and wrath of the anti-Christian majority. I think, sadly, Francis Collins is a tragic example of what I'm talking about. Collins has been celebrated by many Christians because of his acceptance by the secular establishment, but I think those Christians might have been wise to reflect on why the secular establishment has been so approving of Collins. In 2019, the journal Science noted that when Collins originally was appointed as NIH director by President Barack Obama, some worried that his outspoken Christian faith would influence his leadership. But Science went on to assure its readers that the critics need not have worried. As it said, his religion never became an issue. He followed Obama's order to loosen rules for stem cell research, which some Christians oppose, and has defended fetal tissue research despite criticism from anti-abortion groups. A journalist at Slate put it even more bluntly. If Collins' faith mollifies even a few political conservatives who would otherwise continue to waste time and money fighting research efforts that violate their specific religious tenets, then the benefits of his faith should outweigh whatever qualms scientists might have. For more than 12 years, Collins served the secularist agenda at NIH by providing cover for them to do whatever they wanted to do anyway. He championed embryonic stem cell research, the harvesting of baby parts from late-term abortions for scientific research, the marginalization of Christian scientists who are skeptical of unguided Darwinian evolution, the embrace of the LGBTQIA+ movement, and most recently, the demonization and persecution of Christians who had conscience issues with the COVID vax. The sad reality is that it is precisely because of Collins' abandonment of biblical truth in these areas that he rose to the top of the NIH and then became acting science advisor in the Biden White House. Had Collins not become a Stockholm Syndrome Christian, he wouldn't have been tolerated. Collins is indicative of a much broader problem facing Christians who desire Christian influence on culture. Some Christians naively think that if only we had more Christians in positions of power, our society would be different. In truth, we actually have lots of self-identified Christians in government, law, entertainment, and yes, even science. The problem is that far too many of them are Stockholm Syndrome Christians like Collins, and they identify more with the anti-Christian elites than with their own brothers and sisters in Christ or the historic teachings of the Christian church. So their faith is neutered. If we want Christians to bring light to our world, including the world of science, we need to raise up Christians who actually embrace the truths of their faith rather than being embarrassed by them. My book offers practical suggestions on how to do this, but the first step is recognizing the problem.